Hello, and welcome to Northwest Washington Civic Circle's latest community conversation around the Edmonds special election of the RFA annexation with South County Fire. My name is Alicia Crank, the founder and an Edmonds resident. Today, I reached out to other cities that are part of the South County Fire annexation because I thought it would really be an education for all of us to kind of learn how this all started, what the other cities who eventually did vote themselves into annexation kind of went through in their process, which is also mirroring to some degree what's happening in Edmonds right now, and to kind of get a better understanding how it came to be, what were some of the discussions and pros and cons that were coming with that. And I am actually going to turn off everyone's cameras except for our speakers because this is just for that. So Kevin, if you don't mind, thank you. To go on into this conversation. So with that, I am going to ask each of the representative communities to introduce themselves. Just as a point of note that we did invite Mill Creek to also be a part of this discussion, and they did try to move their calendars around to be a part of this, but unfortunately they could not. So with that, I am going to start with George Hurst. Please
Great.
Self-intro.
Great. Thank you. Yes, George Hurst. I'm in my third term now as a Lynnwood City Council member. And my focus has been public safety for our region. I've served on the Snow 911 board. I served on that for 6 years. And then as a little later I'll talk about, but I was the chair of the committee that created the South County Regional Fire Authority way back in 2017. So
And that
happy to
is
be
one of
here.
the things we're going to jump into after the introduction. So thank you for that. Brier.
Hi, my name is Paula Swisher. I am the city clerk treasurer for the city of Brier. I have worked here for 22 years. I was one of the integral people handling our annexation into the RFA. And now I am the council appointed liaison to the Fire Commission board at this time until the end of this year when somebody will be elected to represent our area.
Thank you. And Mountlake Terrace.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Steve Woodard. I have the honor of serving in position 2 here in Mountlake Terrace on our city council. I've been 6 years on council. I have lived in Mountlake Terrace actually just about 20 years, just over actually 20 years, which is in context here to say that was around the time that we signed that contract, which when we get into what our experience was like, I'll bring that forward. But I will say that my experience until I was involved in the renewal here or the annexation was as a private resident, and then clearly as a council member. I served on our subcommittee. I think you folks know that as electeds, we can't convene without public notice in quorum, and so we had a smaller group of us meeting pretty regularly for about a little over a year, and I had the honor of serving on that subcommittee.
Thank you, Steve. So to that note, so I'm going to pass it back to George because I think one of the things that might be interesting for people to know, as I'm starting to learn as well, is kind of the history of this RFA. And I think most people know if they go to South County Fire's website that the RFA came to be in 2017 with Lynnwood and unincorporated Snohomish County, and you were part of those discussions.
Yes, I was. In fact, just to let you know, in 2015 was the first time I ran for office in the city of Lynnwood for the council. And part of my platform was save our fire department, because there was talk of, again, bringing up the idea of RFA. So because of that, and I was elected in 2016, I think it was September 2016, the committee was formed to look at whether we wanted to have a regional fire authority. So it was just between Fire District 1 and the city of Lynnwood. And I'm sure people wanted to get me on there to see if I really would support this. And actually I became the chair of that committee. And so we met from September 2016 to, I think it was April of 2017. And that committee was made up of, there were 3 city electeds from Lynnwood, and some staff, city staff, and then Fire District 1. There were 2, I believe, 2 fire commissioners, and then the staff from Fire District 1. And we went and discussed this, and in the end, I was convinced that really it was a better way to have fire service in Lynnwood. It was going to provide better service for our residents, and give us some cost savings. It really did. So the one thing that convinced me as far as creating this RFA is that we had a fire. We had a fire at the Camelot Apartments, and we had a response. It was a pretty big response. And it just so happened that one of the engines from Fire District 1 was the first engine in. They took over the command of that fire. And we found out there were different protocols that were happening between the 2 departments. And so it was especially about using the self-contained breathing apparatus, different protocols. And so people were being sent in and out at different times, and it just was became a mess. No risk of life, but it was just clear that Lynnwood was not being served by just having a separate fire department. So the collaboration between Fire District and Lynnwood was great. And the RFA was created, went to the voters in August of 2017. And if I remember right, it was like a 67% vote as a yes for the RFA. So, I mean, that's my background as far as beginnings of this.
So we had the RFA that started in 2017. Then we have a few years, fast forward to what, 2023 or 2022, I should probably say, with Brier and Mountlake Terrace, and looking at this as well. So Steve, I'm gonna go to you first. It sounds like I think Brier and Mountlake Terrace, it was on the ballot at the same time. But let's start with you. Kind of what was going on in Mountlake Terrace at the time for you guys to start even considering or having a conversation around joining the RFA?
Yeah, wonderful set of questions for sure. I do want to acknowledge, although we don't have Mill Creek in the room, by virtue of us telling our story, we are telling elements of Mill Creek's story. In fact, I'm going to refer to it as we use the Mill Creek model, meaning that they had just gone before us, and I want to say that their passing rate was in the 90s, maybe in the 80s, high 80s, 90s, somewhere around there. Not my city, so I don't remember specifically, but what I mean by the Mill Creek model is they had a wonderful FAQ page on their website. There was already a tested process partnership with South County Fire, doing presentations, being accessible to your city. So that had already happened before us. So we were really able to benefit from a lot of that, which now let's pull back to your actual question, what was going on. So for us, we are at this point, as I mentioned in my introduction, somewhere in the 2003, 2004 era, we signed into a 20-year contract. And so we were a contract relationship with South County Fire. So when we get to 2022, we're nearing the end of that contract. If specifically, the contract would end at the end of 2024. So basically, January 1st, 2025, meaning this year, we would have had to have had a new plan. Pause just to say that we are already in relationship with South County Fire for a number of years, which does play into how it made it for an easier conversation. By no means was it easy, but easier. But I'm a big storyteller, so I don't want to go too deep into this, but just know that we started the process in April of 2022, which is when we set the subcommittee. It would be a full year, 2023, the April special election, where we put it on the ballot, and it did pass at 92%. A lot of reasons why we put it on that one, mostly around time, that if the voters didn't agree with it, we still had time to either refine it and bring it back, for another vote or to figure out well, what really needs to happen. But time was on our side versus if we had waited and put it on a different election. That said, 2022 is right around the time that I think we are getting our first vaccinations, which is why I was going to say I actually set my room up the way it was back in 2022. I legislated from this space. There was no dais. We were from 20, as you know, 20 to 22, working from your home or whatever space you had. So if you look at ours, which I do want to give credit to, if you really want to follow our story, you can actually trace that through MLT News. They did a wonderful job of covering this process with us. So you're welcome to look through that. As also through our website. We have all the minutes and meetings that you can look at the live time how this went. But at the end of the day, the contract was ending. And the imagery that I would use for folks is, as I said to you, I moved here in 2023, or excuse me, 2003. And now when I have this conversation, in fact, we just had Chris Collier come to our council to talk about housing and how two dentists living together can't afford a house here in Mountlake Terrace or Mountlake Terrace in Snohomish County. The point of that story being when we say, hey, we signed a contract in 03 and it's 20 solid years, but in that same period, I will tell you, I couldn't afford my house today that I could in 03. And so South County Fire is facing that same scenario, if you will, meaning that times have changed, money has adjusted. So there was no way they were going to re-sign a contract that not only did those 2 decades allow them to grow into who they are, but they were no longer interested in contracts, but they also were really focused on serving your city. So in that regard, there were just some parity issues that we were going to have to face one way or the other. If we didn't annex in, we were not getting that same deal that we had in the past. So one way or the other, we were going to be paying quite a bit. So that was kind of the picture that we were painting, or was painted in front of us. And again, we're still at that point, just coming out of COVID. So things are even more, sharp, if you will. People's finances have really come crystallized in those last couple of years. So to have this conversation about your property taxes and taxes in general wasn't going to be an easy one, but that was the context we faced. And again, I just want to end it with, at the end of it all, our voters did say 92%. Yeah, let's annex in.
Yeah. And so Paula, same for you. So around that same time, how much of what was happening in Brier mirrors Mountlake Terrace or opposite?
A lot of it. Steve hit it on the head when he talked about that our contract was going to basically double if we tried to stay on a contract because we needed to pay parity. One of the ways that I dealt with my council that was giving me pushback as we were moving forward in the process, because they didn't like the idea of having the taxpayers take on the burden. And we had an outside company, Burke Consulting, did a presentation and a report for us to show what our long-term financial goals would be. And if we had tried to take on fire ourselves, they said that in 2029, we would be in the hole. Unfortunately for us, we negotiated a couple of new contracts right after we joined the RFA. And those employment contracts have put us back into that place again. So we have a levy on the ballot in April as well, for a levy lid lift. The RFA provides fabulous service to us, and there was no way that Brier could stay Brier if we had taken on the burden of paying parity. And for me, it's only fair that we pay parity because the guy who lives across the street from our people, how can you ask him for more money to provide services that we benefit from too when we weren't paying our share? And so that was really a lot of the conversation that was had here in Brier, that we needed to step up and do our share to have the good services that we all benefit from.
And so your part of your answer actually dovetailed into the next question that I had specifically for you, or for Brier, that was submitted by one of our residents. And I'm going to read the question in its entirety, which was, Brier, the city's budget issues affected the annexation decision by the voters. Now a levy lit lift, as you just mentioned, is on the ballot in April. Why did the city decide to exempt all the seniors with property tax exemption levels A, B, and C from the new tax levy?
So we didn't exempt them. They will be entitled to the same discounts and exemptions that they get through the county right now. It's just not automatic. Apparently there is that we could have put language in there that they'd automatically not have to pay the 50 cents per thousand that we're asking as an increase. But we felt that since anyone who already qualifies for the senior, disabled, low income tax exemptions that they get through the county, that still applies to the levy lid lift if it passes as well. So they will still get those. And the Burke report was done using 2022 numbers, while a lot of the presentations and everything came out in 2023. They were not numbers that had all of that increase in salaries that happened to us. We had our entire public works staff we found was underpaid. That was disturbing, and we had to make some decisions that if we wanted to retain and attract good quality people, we were going to have to be more competitive, because we're surrounded by all these bigger cities that have bigger budgets. And they were stealing our people left and right.
So there's been a lot of back and forth on this senior property tax exemption, where certain people are saying this is going to happen, and they're saying no, it's not going to happen, and this is why. Is there anything documented somewhere that speaks to this in one way or the other?
I'm not 100% sure which thing it falls into, whether it's state or county or what, but the way that the exemptions work is that you fill out the paperwork for the county, who collects the taxes for us. We don't ever even see it. All we see is that maybe our tax might go down a little bit, and the county makes all of the decisions through the assessor's office if you qualify for those exemptions. And it's just, you fill out the paperwork, you qualify, it's automatic. We as cities don't get a say. It's not anything that we can or cannot go, oh, they don't deserve that. No, don't do that. It's just automatic and out of our hands.
But not a city function.
No.
Okay. Just wanted to get some clarification on that. And then I'll toss it back to either Steve or George. I'm just curious to know, do your respective cities have anything going on with levy lifts or anything that's happened with the budget since annexation that's impacting your bottom line right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for Lynnwood. Lynnwood's pretty unique among cities. Sales tax is 42% of our revenue. Property tax maybe is our number 4 source of revenue. So we're kind of in a different boat than other cities. So right now, no, we're not looking at a levy lift or anything like that. We're if all our forecasts, economic forecasts pan out, we're going to be okay. No, we don't. We're not on the brink yet, but who knows what this economy is going to do? Because we're so dependent on sales tax, that's pretty volatile. So we could take a big hit if things really go upside down.
Yeah, thank you, George.
Steve, we lost your volume. Can't hear you. Uh-oh. And my next question is for you, so we got to get you fixed. But no. Uh-oh. Yeah. Let's see. So George, I'm gonna skip
Yeah.
to the next question with you until we can get Steve settled up. There was a question that came in about, but this is for all of you though, but there was a question that came in about
About now.
Oh, there you are.
Ooh,
Yes.
there you are.
All right. So now I'm coming
So-
back to you. There's
okay.
less editing for
So-
me.
So let this go on record as this is why Gen X should not be doing things on the internet. I was trying to get a friend into this meeting who was already in and apparently lost my volume. So I apologize, everybody.
That's okay.
Let me jump back to that question though and just round that out and say that I think Mountlake Terrace's story is closer to Lynnwood's right now. Let's be clear, we are on the same path as Edmonds in terms of some really sincere decisions having to be made about services provided. They're always sincere. That wasn't the word I was looking for. This is the word that came out of my mouth. But nonetheless, so we're a couple years behind that. And we're not having any conversations about live and anything like that. We actually are still trying to figure out how to lower taxes and provide, but we do have a lot of big bills coming down the line. And at this point, trying to figure out, well, what can we do from an economic development standpoint so that we don't have to raise taxes? That wasn't exactly your question, but I was just putting it out there that we're not quite there, but we're right on that same kind of hill looking down, going, how do we avoid this ride?
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to stay on you for our next
Okay.
question, well, starting with you at least.
Sure.
So another question that came in is around what were some of the concerns that were raised during your deliberations in regards to joining the RFA, and if any of those concerns were addressed or resolved or nothing?
Yeah, no, great questions, by the way. I would say ours fell into three categories pretty consistently. The first one being safety. Our reality is we are very fortunate to, as I said, already have a relationship with South County Fire. And so when we looked at our other two options, one you've already heard, which was our same story as well. We could have started our own fire department. We would have been done within 6 months in terms of bankrupt, though, just for the record. So Brier's a little better off than us from the sounds of it. If you made it a whole year, it's just to say that, this is not an inexpensive experience called the fire department. Just them having to adjust to everything that's new and climate change demands and all of that. So it's a very expensive endeavor. But the other option that we had, because we are fortunate to, I always say we're the gateway to Snohomish County if you're coming up from that other one to the south of us. They have a system down there as well, and we're good friends with Shoreline. But the reality is at that point, your 911 call being routed to King County versus I am genuinely down the street and did have the fire department, they sent their paramedics come to my house to help out in a family matter, versus having that call go down to a call center somewhere downtown, make its way back up here. I will just tell you, as you know, where you put that directional in front of that number matters. So northeast first is not the same as first northeast, and they have the nerve to put them on the same map in the same city, right? So in that regard, that safety was an issue. The next one, just to speed it up here, of course, was cost. And that was just, no matter how you looked at it, cost was going up. You already heard the conversation about parity. We had an amazing deal as time would play on. I bet you we didn't think it was amazing in 23 or 2003 when we signed it. I bet we were like, oh my gosh, it's unbelievable. And now here we are, fast forward to 2025 going, good Lord, we really had a deal. And again, a lot has happened in that time period. And then the last one for us, which is the question you have later, I believe, is really this ownership of the building. Our situation is very interesting. We own the land, and a lot of that is because how it was, how the plot or the plat works out. You couldn't separate it. So really it was just the building above that mattered. And then folks, I'm not sure how yours is set up, but our fire department and our police department share the building. So it wasn't just ownership, it was also use. So between those three, safety, cost, and ownership, we were there. And just to kind of finish off the point here, we were able to address a little bit of cost, which I will just say we used our property tax. So when we no longer pay the city to pay the contract, now you're paying directly. The EMS levy, I always get this wrong. Basically, we had about $1.7 million that we would still have back, and we had the right to use that money to either hold on to it, give some of it back, or give all of it back to lower the property taxes. And we decided to give all of it back to lower property taxes, although we held about $50,000 of that for a relief fund for folks who couldn't pay. So a lot of words there, but hopefully I answered your question. Safety, cost,
Yeah.
ownership.
Paula, I'm gonna ask you to go next and then George.
So a lot of our concern was, of course, the cost increase was what we heard from a lot of the people. And then I had one council member in particular who liked to do the cost per call. And it's really irrelevant what the cost per call is because Brier has less calls than everybody else. So of course that makes our calls inherently cost higher per call. But it's about having the readiness and the resource available when you pick up that phone and make the call to 911. The other thing, of course, was, well, you know, you need to cut. Brier only has 18 full-time employees right now for a population of just under 6,700 people. Other cities that have population similar to us have more than double the staffing that we have. While our sales tax did go up a little bit because of COVID, we only get, because we have 5 businesses in town and everything, it's destination sales tax we get. We only get about $500,000 a year in sales tax. It doesn't pay much. And the other thing we heard is that we're special. And I had to keep explaining to everybody that Brier is unique. We are not special. We still need the same exact response that everybody else needs, whether it be for cardiac arrest or a house fire or whatever. And you can't skimp on that, because who wants to be that person that, oh, I'm sorry, you know, we can't come to your call because there aren't enough bodies to cover it because you're special. And so those were some of the things that happened to us repeatedly when people were chatting with us about the issue.
And me?
Yes.
Okay, so some of the, you know, it's interesting. I think it's more true fire department, but it also goes for police department. People are emotionally attached to having their own fire department and police department for their cities. It's just, some folks just don't want to give that up. And so we had to get over, you know, that pushback. But as far as, you know, city council, we were looking at, we had a ladder truck in our station that was, they called a dry stick. It couldn't pump water. So in order for it to go on a response, it would a pumper would have to follow the ladder truck. And because of our staffing, that meant we had to abandon one of our aid cars if that was happening. And it just seemed like staffing became a real concern for me and for public safety. I think people were a little concerned about, well, the cost, because we were unique. We were the first ones. So we had the Fire District 1 entity out there that had surrounded Lynnwood with contracts, and people were wondering, well, what are they going to charge? You know, what's going to happen? And we were faced in the last budget before we joined the RFA. Our fire department, it was $12 million annually for our fire department for our 2 stations. And the concern was, well, we needed to actually fully staff this ladder truck, and you know, our costs were going to go up again, because if you're going to staff a truck, that's 3 firefighters, and in firefighter math, that's actually 12 more people, because you basically, at that time, it was about 4 FTEs for 1 FTE of firefighter, just because of the schedule. You know, it's a 24-hour service, so 24/7 service. So I think the pushback for Lynnwood was, what's it all going to cost? And in the end, it worked out fairly well for us.
Well, I'm going to stay on that line of questioning and stick with you on this one, George, for this one, because that was
Mhm.
another question that came in from audience members where, since we're talking about cost per resident, cost per call, if you happen to know, what was your annual, kind of cost per resident before annexation and then after? And I think maybe the genesis of that question is, was there a savings or are you paying more because you're in this
Yeah.
annexation? But I'll leave that as the question. And the same thing with your per 911 cost as well.
Okay. Yeah, the per capita one is kind of, that's in the weeds and maybe, the RFA could answer that. But I can tell you that I know when we had our fire department, our the one thing I can track is our per thousand cost for taxes. And when we had the fire department, it was the residents were paying, I think it was 1.9 per thousand. And right now, we've exceeded that. We've just now exceeded that this year just because we had a big property tax increase for the city. So in other words, we kept it, as far as the mills, we kept it pretty level, that once the fire department left us, we didn't see a big increase. If you combine the two property taxes from the city and the fire and the RFA, those mills stayed pretty consistent, at a consistent level. So that's the best I can do. Per capita, I don't, I didn't have that. And as far as the 911 calls, again, this is what's interesting, as when this RFA was being created, we also were consolidating two call centers. Snowcom and Snowpack were being consolidated into one call center. And so there's a lot of mixed up monetary data that just doesn't blend to tell you, well, we saved so much because of 911. But I did find the last year we had a fire department and a police department. The fire department 911 assessment was $260,000, and so that would have dropped out. But then again, then you have the police. It's all based on calls. So the next year, I think our police calls went way up, and so it didn't seem like we were saving much. But that's where it's kind of hard to get that data, because it is based on the calls. So that's a
Brian.
kind of, so that was a muddled up answer to that question.
I appreciate the effort. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about Brier?
So I ran some numbers. So the cost per resident when we were in our contract in 2023 for our last year was $219.17. In 2024, based on the rough figure of, I went with 2.5 million from RFA, had we had to contract with them again, that would have taken it up to $388.98 per resident. And our calls, because again, we didn't have a lot of calls, in 2023, we had 460 calls for aid and fire, and that equated to $3,077.96 per call on contract. And in 2024, when we were part of the RFA, we had 543 calls, and that is equivalent to $4,604.05 per call. But it also isn't done by call. It's you want somebody to be there when you make that call and come and respond to you. It's about responsiveness, and it's about the resources that it takes to provide that, not just to our city, but the RFA is a whole huge area. It's the people outside our city, our neighboring cities. It takes a lot to provide those kind of services and those kind of response times.
Mountlake Terrace.
Yeah, so this is where I usually remind people I'm a poet, not a statistician. So I'm just going to say, good time to remind us that my city manager, Jeff Knighton, did make it clear that if anybody really wanted to drill down, he's happy to have that conversation with you. So just want to put that out there that I'm not going to get the numbers right. And then I pull back and kind of say, at the end of it all, my residents just wanted to know how much more are they paying more in their property taxes. And I will say that the placard that we put up that almost came out true basically was a 2,000 square foot home assessed at $606,000 and some change there would see a net increase of about $395 a year, which translates back to about $32 to $39 more a month. And so in our case, that's about what it turned out to be. We are seeing that you're paying more. But the question about are you seeing more calls? Are you, the per capita and all that, or just all of that? It's like, again, folks just want to know at the end of the day, if I make a call, am I waiting too long? Am I having to be put on hold? Was this the right number to call? I will say South County Fire's done a wonderful job of really highlighting that you can save a lot of money by getting people to use the non-emergency line of their equivalent. That might not be what it's called. They have a name for it, of course, but nonetheless, just even getting that education out there, I don't want to lose sight that this was one of the biggest probably gains for us that won't show up as a probably material savings, but definitely was an opportunity where we had a solid year and a half of just talking about how the system works. It also, in our case, we were able to remind ourselves there's a lot of resources out there for seniors that they may not have known about, that through this process, we were able to at least make sure that we were getting that information out in tandem with this very complicated decision. So in that regard, again, at the end of it all, we are definitely paying more, but that was inevitable. At the bottom line, we were going to all pay $32 more a month. That was just to get us to parity. And then, of course, as I said, when we made decisions about how to use some of the savings, that brought that number one way or the other for folks. But end of the day, we feel it was the right decision in the spirit of we haven't seen any break in contact. And I will say, no one likes this part, but when you pull back and, we keep saying the fire department, they're really misnamed at this point. Fire is such a small sliver of what they actually deal with that, we miss all these other ways that they're there for the community. But that said, when that fire breaks out, time does matter. And I will just say she's passed on. But I never forget this part, which is while we were in this very process, and then right after our vote, one of the pillars of our community and her neighbor had a major catastrophe, and both of their homes burned down. It was very significant to lose one home, let alone two, but it could have been more than that being the point because it was in a condensed portion of our city. And that fire could have jumped, and instead we had the response time that you would want and the care afterwards that you would expect. Which is just to say, these conversations are in the abstract until it's in live time happening to your family or your neighbor or your neighborhood. Which, I will say, if you go back to the record, I try to remind ourselves that we're not having conversations about do we want to have an extra pool lane or do we want this? We're talking about do we want these superheroes to keep doing the work in our community? And how much is that going to cost us? More importantly, how do we make sure that in having those superheroes here, there's nobody getting displaced in that process? And so in that regard, it was a lot of give take. But again, we couldn't stay at those same numbers. So Mountlake Terrace was going to have to make a decision. And at the end of the day, it was going to be at least $32 a month more. And again, that's pretty much what it's played out to be.
I'm going to say that one of the things that has stood out to me during this conversation is the concept of time. And when I say that, I mean that hearing from all of you, like you had a good year to kind of vet through some of these things. And I think that's kind of one of the frustrations that's coming through in Edmonds right now is that we haven't had that much time for whatever those reasons are. And our elected officials can talk about that if they want to. But so I think that was one thing that's standing out to me right now is this whole year and a half of being able to talk about it and vet it. And I think for us here in Edmonds, and I'm one of those people, is that, I think the announcement came relatively quickly. And that is one of the arguments that has been made by some folks in the community of, can we pause or saying no so that we can pause? And I'm going to tell you right now, it's kind of making sense to me, that argument, not necessarily saying I'm taking that position, but the concept of time. And I think that's also contributing to some of the questions that have been sent my way for any of these conversations. I think a lot of people don't know where these questions should land because we have such a truncated amount of time. So I know some of the questions that came in, and I also shared with you, had to do with staffing and all these other things. Like, is that something that's within the purview of your representation as far as the RFA is concerned? What questions belong to commissioners, for example? When we, because I know you've referenced a couple of times, like taking that back to the RFA. Are we talking about the commissioners? Are we talking about South County Fire staff? Can you kind of, and again, can you kind of help us level set to kind of where do the cities come in and what they can weigh in on versus what are questions that are more appropriate to have a commissioner be able to weigh in on because they have those responsibilities?
I jump in here
Yeah.
because I actually sit on the fire commissioner board and I'm part of their weekly meetings. I get to speak my piece on behalf of the citizens of Brier at their meetings, and my opinions are taken into consideration. But the last 4 questions that you provided to us are not they're not even questions about how we joined the RFA or why we joined the RFA. They're questions that would be appropriate to ask RFA staff or the commissioners to give those answers about staffing, about
And again, and I don't
costs.
even disagree with that, but I just think that there is a learning curve, which is one of the reasons why I want to have these conversations, because I think people don't know where that's supposed to go. And so it's just kind of everything coming out. And so for those watching, there were questions that came through about the RFA 2025 budget. And, why do we have certain, there was actually a question I didn't send over that talked about, the 24-hour, the scheduling versus doing something that's more like nurses. And again, I think these are all good questions, but I think part of the issue is not knowing where to source answers for some of these questions. And because there's roadblocks that are being hit, it's adding to the frustration.
So
I'd like to
please.
address, sorry.
Yeah,
I'd
go
like
ahead,
to
George.
address the thing about time. But, when I said that the committee met from September to April, those were daytime meetings. Public really didn't attend. I mean, they were open meetings, but nobody really attended them. And so really for Lynnwood residents, they only had from April, and then the vote was in August. So it was late April, so May, June, July, 3 months to try to figure out, did we want to actually create this RFA? So I think I don't want to leave the impression that we had lots of time to talk about this. In fact, we were when the draft was presented to the council, I got upset because the council itself didn't really have a lot of time to look at this draft. And I wanted to delay things a couple of weeks, and there wasn't time to do that because we had to make that decision to get it onto the August ballot. And so I know that things may seem rush in Edmonds, but sometimes that's what happens. And that's what happened in Lynnwood. And we just had to really educate the people a lot. And, it did pass. So just trying to correct. No, we didn't have, 9 months to look at this. It was like 3 or 4 months for the residents.
Yeah, and I'll build upon that as well and say, similar, time is one of those interesting concepts, because what I will say is the variables never changed. So, having it's 12 months versus having 6 months versus having 3, the variables didn't change. And the variables are pretty straightforward in terms of what your options are. And so for us, I would say, one of the things that I did factor in is, again, we had Mill Creek right before us. So we were able to all but cut and paste and then update it for our specific 4 square miles. That's time that we were able to put that on a website and then direct people to it. We did our best to track, how many people were going to it, but to George's point, especially the subcommittee member, we had a lot of meetings, but it were usually just us and South County Fire. as opposed to our residents being there, but it was also helping us with our messaging, just in the bigger scheme of it all. And then there really were, as I said, the building itself was probably where we had the biggest, or at least the most amount of time dedicated of what that would look like. And I will just say, you know, us as a city, we wanted to make sure our residents got the most out of it. And in that way, I would say, I had a chance to hear one of your clips from one of your earlier conversations, and one of your residents had a point blank question. This building's about to cost a lot of money. Who's going to pay for that? So in that regard, you know, we had that same scenario. That's before you start talking about generators, which we all learned how important generators are now, and all that's kind of a post-COVID scenario. But again, we also had the mixed use with our police department, which had its own matters going on as well. But you know, at the end of it all, I just want to be clear: the variables won't change. So I do empathize with the scenario that you all are facing from Edmund's perspective of feeling like it's condensed. But I think it feels that way because you've had 5 cities before you, all within this kind of lifetime, go right ahead of you that you can learn from, to where, you know, I don't know, at the end of the day, the fire department is not the same fire department as it was 20 years ago. Fires are not the same as they were. Buildings aren't the same, which was, you know, the part where I go, this is probably a good time to be self-closed here and say, I should have been a firefighter if I wasn't going to be who I am today. And part of me still is, which is just to say, you know, the materials that they encounter now burn faster, hotter, and longer, which puts them in more danger, right? I mean, I remember one of my first votes for this council, and it's going to sound like it was separate, but it's all connected, was looking at how big your house can be before we have to make it mandatory that you put a sprinkler system in there, because you are just making this way too dangerous for everybody. This big cavernous house is now a warehouse, and our firefighters are in there trying to do their job, and it's not fair, which is more conversation than you have with the 12 minutes left, but nonetheless, to saying all of this is interconnected, which raises those prices. So I appreciated the question about why are they getting $500,000 salary, just for people who didn't see what the questions were. I think that was one of the observations. And it's like, well, I have no idea, but I'm glad I have a commissioner now, at least the opportunity, who can ask that. Because before I was just a contract and that was who we mapped into, but now we're part of the family. So we can ask those questions. But then that said, I also go, well, there's a lot of stress in the world. So I imagine as a firefighter and the boss, if you will, that's a lot on you. And I guess this is how we compensate you, is with money. But I don't know that to be true. I'm just saying from where I'm sitting, we now can ask that question now that we're annexed in, where before it was just another organization that clearly played an important role, but still it was a contract relationship. Now it's a familial relationship, if you will. At least we have some say in it.
And then you just brought up another question for me. Hold on one second, Paul. I'm gonna get to you in a second. But something that Steve just said just gave me another question, which is, I love the fact that you guys, that you said that you were able to look at what Mill Creek was on and be able to kind of piggyback off of that. And I think I know the answer from the Brier perspective, but I'm curious to know if you know, have city officials here reached out to your respective cities around what your process was as they're navigating this?
I will say I have not personally had anyone, and I haven't asked any of my colleagues or the city if anybody's reached out. But yeah, so me personally, I have not.
Yeah.
I got to talk to people as they were going through it. Edmonds had the exact same amount of time that Brier and Mountlake Terrace did. We all had 2 years because fire came to us and let us know when we were at the 2-year mark that they would not be renewing our contract at the rate, at the great rate that we had experienced for 20 years, that it was going to go up significantly. And I think Edmonds has done the exact same thing that we did. I spent the whole first year with us finding somebody to do the report, talking, council at so many council meetings. They were all open to the public. The public could have come and listened to any of those conversations that we were having. And Edmonds, I believe, has done the same thing, where the council tried to do their due diligence. We contacted all the different fire agencies around us and found out that there was no one that was going to be able to give us a better rate than South County Fire. When it came down to it, even with the increase, Everyone else was higher than that. And so it isn't rushed. They've done their due diligence. They've asked outside entities to do reports and come back and report to them what would be best in their best interest. And I honestly, Vivian Olson and I had lunch one day so that I could tell her about our experience. And that was pretty early on in the process. And
Well, I think part of it too is nothing this is with any jurisdiction. It's not special to Edmonds. It's not special to South Snohomish County. It's just your average resident during the day is not going to city council meetings or things like that. And they are really reliant on the media or the neighbor that does have the time to have that investment in to share that with others. So and again, and that's one of the reasons why I started doing these conversations, because I was actually surprised that a lot of these presentations and these discussions were not being recorded for people to be able to go back and look at it later, because we all have lives and things are happening. So I know we're not going to have a ton of people here at 4 o'clock to watch this, but at least it's going to be available for later and be able to get it in that context. So I'm hoping that the cities, not just Edmonds, start to embrace that a bit more, knowing, yeah, you're not going to have mass capacity for some of these meetings, even if they're in the evening, because life, especially right now, and what's happening, in our country and in our state and in our cities. So I think just making sure that this information is accessible takes a good step towards that. Are you still going to get everybody and get all the input when you want to get it? Probably not. But I do have one final question. I think this is one that you can answer because you alluded to it a couple of times, and it is about the buildings. So this was a question that came in as well. And we'll start with you, Steve, because I know you brought up a couple of times already. How did your city address the ownership of the fire stations? And presuming that, again, these facilities were purchased with public money.
Yeah, so great question, and I will say full disclosure, that's in the weeds for me. I'm not 100% sure the nuts and bolts of it. I figured that was all in the back end transactions. But the takeaway here really, it wasn't so much the building that was the bigger piece, it was the land underneath it. I think a lot of the cities are in a situation where they're selling the land underneath it as well. South County Fire absolutely wanted the entire parcel. But again, the way that in luck or poor planning, one of the two, the way that our city in that particular space is organized, it was not one discrete, this is your parcel. So then when you looked at the building, I think it was just factored into more about the upkeep. I don't know that the building's already paid for, if you will, but really it's about, well, what's going to happen when that roof goes out, which is one of the many roofs that we have, in a city that's 70 years old and a lot of original buildings still here, if you will. Those roofs are on their way out. And so it was things like that we negotiated. Well, who's going to pay for that in this idea of the ownership being transitioned over? But again, at the end of it all, you can have this building, but if you don't own the land underneath, I don't know that we can tell you move your building, but I mean, theoretically speaking, the bigger issue for us was who was the actual space owner. But that said, South County Fire stepped up, and again, they're going to replace the roof in their own time. The generators, they've paid pieces of that, which is a longer story that folks may or may not know. Mountlake Terrace, we are now actually, our city hall is there, and that's 3-4 years old at the most. And again, what we learned about generators and needs that wasn't factored in, it was and it wasn't, and so here we find ourselves having to figure out how to keep the police department, fire department, and city hall going if there was a power outage. But that bill wasn't all the cities to pay for. We were able to have that conversation with South County Fire, which is a longer story now about, well, now waiting on the generator to get here. And that's a whole supply chain demand of remembering the context that we're in. The world is still spinning, COVID's still happening, tariffs are still being waged, so prices are fluctuating and all that. But it was in our interest to go ahead and release the building to them. And again, it was one of the stipulations that they had.
How do you, George?
Yeah, I'll talk about it. So we had 2 fire stations. Station 15, the HVAC, before the RFA, the HVAC was failing. We had doors that were not earthquake proof, so that if we had an earthquake, they might not even open the doors. And then Station 14, which is a smaller station, was going to have to be remodeled because the dorm rooms, it was built for an all male staff, and we no longer had just male firefighters. We had women firefighters. That station had to be remodeled. And so the choice was, well, we spend a lot of money to fix those stations, or the RFA could take care of it, and we do have a buyback option if they ever close those stations. 15 will never be closed, maybe 14, I don't know. But things had to be done, and it was just I wouldn't say it was an easy decision, but it was a decision that had to be made. Yeah, our buildings were failing, and so let's make it part of the RFA and let them take care of all that cost.
And Paula.
Brier didn't own the station.
Oh.
The station was, the land that it's on was bought by the fire district. It was erected by the fire district. We don't have that problem here. That was somebody else's problem.
Okay. Well, the final question I want to leave you all with, and that'll kind of be like our closing comment, would be around, I just lost my train of thought that quickly. What kind of input would you give from an educational perspective for those of us in Edmonds who are trying to, take in all the information, get accurate information on either side of the argument, in consideration for preparing for this vote? What do you feel would be the most helpful?
Are you starting with me?
Sure.
You have two things to consider. Number
Okay.
one, how is your city going to pay for fire if you don't annex? Because your city already has a deficit. And number two, then you'll also have to deal with your deficit if it doesn't pass, because it will become an even deeper hole when they're trying to come up with the money next year. You get more say by being a member of the RFA because you get the representation on their board. Right now you're a contract city. You don't get to vote on any levies. You don't get to vote for anything that has to do with the RFA because you're a contract city.
Actually, Paula, I'm going to stop you, and it's my fault because you just reminded me of what my final question was. And it was about representation on as far as the commission. So what input can you give us here in Edmonds from that perspective, whether or not we vote in to be part of annexation versus not? And I know you started to touch on that right there.
I've had a great time being a representative for the city of Brier on there. I would highly recommend that they get somebody who works for the city and is looking out for the city's best financial interest and can impart that wisdom on people within the RFA when topics are coming up that that will eventually roll downhill and affect your taxpayers. I feel I have had influential, even though I can't vote myself at this point, I have influenced the votes that the commissioners have made on a lot of topics because I have a different perspective. Part of it is I'm not an elected, so I give my honest opinion. But Edmonds will have that as well. They'll have a liaison for however long. Once you're in, they'll be voting on the two positions that are at-large positions that come available, I believe, in 2027. And then once the redistricting is done, they'll be voting on somebody who is specific within their district. And you will have much more say in what's happening, because if there are things to do with the benefit charge or a levy lid lift, Edmonds gets to vote on that. Whereas right now, Edmonds is left out because you're on a contract, and your contract could be affected if you were to stay on contract by everybody else's votes because you're not part of that group.
George, or we'll see. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Go ahead, Steve.
yeah, I'll go quick. I absolutely would echo exactly what Paula has shared. Thank you for that. I won't tarnish it by adding my own words to it. Instead, I'll give a different example and say, I also would probably encourage you, now that we've been in this for a year, to also think about kind of what does it actually look like to be in the RFA, where things that aren't being discussed right now. And the example I want to use is we now have a different expectation of how the building permits are being signed off on. I imagine folks know how building permits work, but the fire section of that is very specialized. And so under the former contract, I will say our fire marshal is awesome. David's awesome. But that's a huge workload, and this problem existed before the RFA decision. This has been a kind of a long-term issue. Now you can clown Mountlake Terrace and say, well, what building over Mountlake Terrace? Well, we're up and coming, folks, right? We remodeled our town center and we got a lot going on. And so it's just to kind of remind ourselves that, you're signing into something for a long term, but there's some immediate payoffs that would have been barriers before, because now at least we can have the conversation about, well, how many building permits are being signed off on in a timely fashion in our city, or at least, recognize that these things come in season. So maybe we don't need to up the number of people doing the signing off for the full 12 months, but there might be some windows there. I would like to think that now, as being a part of the family, if you will, that we get to have that conversation instead of being a contract. And to that point, one of those questions was also this idea that I think it said Mountlake Terrace wasn't getting anything different. I will say, no, actually, our contract did not adjust for the fact that we're close to 25,000 people, residents. And we're going to continue to grow. And so in that regard, we actually are getting a handful of adjustments, which are not worth going into now, but just wanted to say we did see some tangible changes that the former contract didn't allow for us to act upon, that now that we're part of the RFA, we can. And again, I'm just going to stick with the building permits as an example, because there was a shortage already, and that's not going to change as all of us continue to try to raise the profile, not just on the commercial side, but still even on the residential side. Those permits matter.
George, you get the final word.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, if you don't join the RFA, you don't have a voice then. That's the key. You get to be part of the board, you get to have input into decisions. It's obvious that continuing out as a contract isn't going to be feasible. I know, let me just make my pitch real quick as far as that contract and what seems to be a big increase in costs for a contract. Just remember, in 2017, Lynnwood had two stations, and our fire department was $12 million in our budget. I heard that Edmonds' contract was $12 million now, or the one that's being ended, for 3 stations. Right now, stations are what, $6 to $7 million each. So for you to say, or for people to say, well, this contract is going up, $7, $8 million. Yeah, that's right, it is, because that's the reality. But you can't almost put a price tag on safety. I mean, shoot, the RFA, just the medical response itself, we are safer. If you have a heart attack within the RFA, you have a better chance of survival than if you're in Seattle with Medic One. They are, they have a different type of protocol with the RFA, but it's successful. And Sean Maxwell, who's the MS Medical's head of medical, he's nationally recognized for what he is. So, all I can say is the RFA gives you a lot of premium things that you don't want to turn down into, for folks who want to look at something, they really do need to look at the Fitch study. I know a lot of people want to do their own research. I did in 2015. I was thinking, I know about these things. Rely on the experts. Fitch knows what they're doing. Look at the other cities that have joined since the RFA has been created. It's going to be best for Edmonds, even though it's a hard ask, for the money. It really is, but you got to do it.
Paula, George, Steve, thank you so much for giving of your time for this conversation. I know I learned a few things coming out of it, especially around the timing and the public buildings and kind of what is in the purview of, you know, what falls under your jurisdictions versus the commissioners and the RFA in general. So thank you so much. Where I am planning one final conversation that will kind of center around property tax. So we're reaching out to the assessor's office about that. So hopefully we'll be doing that before ballots drop. But either way, thank you so much. Thank you everyone who joined us live. And for those who will watch this, hopefully in a few minutes when we put it online. So thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you,
Okay.
Alicia.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation.